Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the LSE, those of you who aren't always at the LSE, for this evening's Behavioral Research Lab public discussion. I'm Craig Calhoun, the director of the LSE, and it's a great honor for me to welcome Professor Richard Thaler to the LSE for a second time. As I'm sure everyone in the audience is aware, Professor Thaler is among the world's leading behavioral economists and perhaps the most important pioneer of the field. Thanks in no small part to his work, behavioral economics is now increasingly recognized not only as an academic field, but as a key part of public policy making. As an academic field, it is not only a part of a wider discipline of economics, but part of a transdisciplinary behavioral science. In public policy, we all know now what is signaled by the notion of governments nudging their citizens into making better decisions. When I was younger and a student at Columbia University, I learned the word nudge, which had a sort of local New York meaning. I learned the word nudge, which had a local New York meaning from Yiddish, which has been transformed into nudge and into UK English as well, as it has entered into the lexicon of policymakers here, partly through your work, together with LSE leaders like Julian Legrand. Here at LSE, we've seen our own community of behavioral scientists grow, and over the past 5 years, we've developed the LSE Behavioral Research Lab, a purpose-built facility designed for the use of researchers examining behavior in organizations, as well as launching the world's first executive masters in behavioral science. Colleagues throughout the LSE in a range of departments, from social psychology, now being renamed psychology and behavioral science, to management, Stickard, in economics, the Marshall Institute, and the International Growth Center are all also active. Now, not that Richard needs much of an introduction, it's worth saying that he's devoted a 40-year career to the study of how people make decisions, with the key finding that human beings are more akin to Homer Simpson than to the rational actors assumed in traditional economic thinking. He started his career in the 1970s as a student at the University of Rochester, having some crucial connections made at Stanford University that he recounts in his new book, and moving to the Johnson Graduate School of Management at Cornell University for 2 decades, and then to the University of Chicago. I think it's fair to say that throughout this, Richard found himself engaged in spirited battles with the bastions of traditional economic thinking. And lest you are sure that we are always in the vanguard, the London School of Economics was not the fastest of all leading economics departments to embrace behavioral economics, though we like to think we are now fully on board. Today, Richard is the Ralph and Dorothy Keller Distinguished Service Professor of Behavioral Science and Economics and the Director of the Center at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, which is the world's oldest academic center devoted to decision research. Richard's also the co-director of the Behavioral Economics Project at the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research, a position he shares with Professor Robert Shiller. On top of all of these activities, he's a global best-selling author, including famously of Nudge.
Thank you.
Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, with Kath Sunstein. This evening, I will be interviewing Richard for 45 minutes about his book, Misbehaving. I'm going to try to interview as unobtrusively as possible, because you're all interested in him, not me, but I will prod the conversation along a bit. Misbehaving is a term that Richard defines as not doing something wrong, but doing something inconsistent with economic theory. Now, I'd like to report that this makes it a universal human attribute. I'm not a behavioral economist, but I want to speculate on a possible finding. I've observed over the last 4 years of watching events like this at the LSE that there are people who will devote an evening to coming to hear a distinguished author at a book launch, but who will not choose to spend an evening reading his work. or can't find the willpower to make themselves do it. I mention this now because in this case, you should not only buy, but read Misbehaving. It's a really good book. If you need an additional incentive for buying it, at the end of this event, Richard will be available to sign copies of his books. Misbehaving and Nudge are both available for purchase outside. For Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is #LSE Thaler. I would ask you to please put your phones on silent so as not to disrupt the event. This evening's event is being streamed and recorded and will hopefully be made available as a podcast. The format is I will talk with Richard for about 3/4 of an hour and then open to questions from the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
So
let's start. The organization of the book combines biography and anecdotes and reflections and a lot of key findings. A fair amount of it is centered on decision-making, core field of your work throughout. Not quite all of it. You recognize a debt to Kahneman and Tversky. But let me take up sort of how this works and get you to comment a little bit more. One of the ways it works is that you began fairly early on to notice that a bunch of seemingly irrelevant factors mattered a lot in the way in which people made decisions. That people did things that were hard to explain in economic terms, like remembering their wife's birthday. And is this sentiment, and an older psychology would have it, how do you think about the supposedly irrelevant factors? Is there a unified theory of them, or are they just so many different observations of curious things people do?
well, yeah, it would be nice to have a unified theory, but it ain't gonna happen. If you want a unified theory of economic behavior, then neoclassical economics is it. It just leaves a lot of things out. But there's no unified theory of what those things are. There are categories. So, as you mentioned, self-control problems is a big category. You know, cognitive resources. We're not as smart as the smartest economist.
I'm certainly not.
And we're nowhere near as smart as the smartest economist thinks he is. Yes, I have someone in mind. And we're a bit nicer than economists give us credit for. But, you know, when Cass and I were writing Nudge, which is to do this, as opposed to Nudge, who is a pest. So a nudge is a person and a nudge is an action. Just want you to get that straight, Craig.
On the other hand, a nudge can be a governmental unit charged with taking actions.
No, I saw Owen here, right? What's your title now? Bigwig. The bigwig will attest that, well, first of all, the name of the team is the Behavioral Insight Team, not the Nudge Unit, much as it's often referred to as that. But no one there would dare call it the Nudge Unit. And it wouldn't really be very popular. You don't want to be a nudge.
I understand that.
Yeah, and we don't want to. We don't want to be known as nudgers. Nudgers.
Well, let me go straight into that question, although I sort of interrupted you with it. Exploring the difference between the nudge and the nudgers. One line of argument would be to say that this is social engineering with a hint of a pejorative, or more than a hint, of a pejorative connotation. You're finding ways to control people outside of their conscious choices and voluntary participation by steering the way they make decisions. Fair? Unfair?
Well, I wouldn't say control. You know, Cass and I coined the term libertarian paternalism or liberal paternalism, and we mean it. And so by our standards, a policy qualifies as a nudge if avoiding it is nearly costless, ideally one click. So, you know, I think social engineering, aside from the pejorative connotation, I don't mind thinking about that way. We need, actually, economics needs to become more like engineering and less like physics, right? We want to build bridges that won't fall into the river. So, and so we need to take into account things like wind. And, but we don't try to control people, and we don't try to tell people what to do. We try to help people get where they're going. I like to use GPS as an analogy. If you use GPS, Google Maps, or something like that, you plug in your destination. It gives you a suggested route, which you're free to deviate from. And
Although the little voice may come on and say, please return to the designated.
yeah, although notice they do that less.
Yes, it was unpopular, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, when Hertz used to have Never Lost, which was a great innovation before we all had GPS in our phones, and it was quite annoying. Yeah. If it said turn left here and you didn't, it would say recalculating route, and you know, just do it. Don't tell me about it. So it was a nudge.
Well said. Let me ask about another metaphor. We had economics be more like engineering, and engineering's been a really exciting discipline recently. For one thing, it became very empirical, and one of the features of behavioral economics has been very empirical about a lot of things. But I want to ask first, how you feel about design as a field, which has become a way of thinking with the Stanford Design School and so forth, not just about doing design and sitting there with a sketch pad, but about doing iterations. Designing something, seeing how people use it, doing intensive observation, doing it again. It has some similarities to behavioral games, not exactly, and things like that. Do you see a way of working there that is promising for social scientists, in which we're more like engineers by putting prototypes out?
Absolutely. When we were working on Nudge, I went back and read a book I had read maybe 20 years earlier by Don Norman called The Design of Everyday Things, right, which I think has the single best cover I've ever seen on a book. It's a picture of a tea kettle on which the spout and the handle are on the same side. So just picture that, and then try to think about how you're going to pour the water, and you'll see there's a problem there. But our life is filled with things designed as thoughtfully as that teapot.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see you don't have what we call Norman doors in this room, which are these doors that have the handles that are called pulls.
Yes.
So at the University of Chicago, our campus here, the Booth campus, the main lecture hall like this, the doors that you leave have these pulls. Now, there's a reason they're called pulls. which is they're shouting at you,
Open this inward.
pull. And of course, you have to push to leave. And I point this out the first day of my class, which doesn't prevent somebody from going up to the door. And so, you know, I think I have become much more sensitized to design. And, you know, Apple always had a great aesthetic sense and a great sense of design in ease of use. Somehow weirdly, Microsoft still hasn't got the idea that you could have an on switch instead of Control-Alt-Delete. But I think
Why
on,
one
off-
click where three would do?
Right, yeah, that require two hands.
So, I mean, that world, of course, in Britain, Johnny Ive is a sort of celebrity for his work on the Apple devices, has often opened up to fields like anthropology and to observation in actual use of devices and things like that. Do you see much beginning of an integration in behavioral science generally or behavioral economics between people who are doing experiments that are pretty focused in on their findings and people who are doing observational work, field observation that is not an experimental design, but an attempt simply to watch what people do?
I would say so far, no. And look, I think behavioral economics, I sometimes joke it should be just called Kahneman and Tversky economics, because we've borrowed so much from them. But the behavioral part of behavioral economics really has drawn just from psychology. The other social sciences have barely dented the field. I think part of that is, especially Amos and Danny's work, was easily exportable. And I think an economist would have no idea how to start taking the observations of an ethnographic study and, show me the data.
Indeed. I have to say, my colleague Tim Besley, an LSE economist, just a couple of weeks ago told me he had gotten into anthropology, and it was fascinating, and he was see this was a new frontier. So this may be happening in various ways.
Look, I think
but
other fields like sociology and political science, one could see that happening more quickly than anthropology, but I would love to see behavioral science and behavioral economics borrow from all the disciplines, if we could.
Well, it does seem to me it's potentially a very broad transdisciplinary undertaking that is rooted largely in psychology. A few years ago, when I was president of the Social Science Research Council in the US, there was the Year of Behavior that had been pronounced by the federal government. We're going to have the Year of Behavior, been promoted by the American Psychological Association. And none of the other disciplines ever heard of it or anything. It was an almost all APA sort of venture. And yet, part of the meaning of behavior really was observational research. Part of the meaning of calling it behavioral science wasn't that behavior was so different from action or any of these other sort of terminological things. It was really, let's watch what people do and make empirical research drive our findings rather than formal modeling in some ways. And there it seems to me the range of forms of empiricism's large in all of this.
Yeah, and I think, policy advice has basically been given to economists by default, and especially psychologists have been extremely reluctant to engage. For reasons that I don't really fully understand, applied psychology is a second-class citizen within the field of psychology in a way that's very different from economics. So a field like labor economics, or public finance, has equal status, or monetary policy, right? These are all highly applied fields and high status, but things are changing, and I applaud your use of the term behavioral science. Many people wrongly describe the underlying discipline of the behavioral insight team as behavioral economics, and there's
Rather
actually
than
not
psychology or behavioral science.
Behavioral science is really much more accurate. There's not that much economics going on there.
I mean, I must say here, a lot of the uptake at the LSE has been in management, and that's true elsewhere too, and people with some practical problems to solve who have drawn on behavioral research traditions. But let me stick to one of the things the book recounts, and part of your experience has been engaging law as another discipline, and also not unrelated to public policy engagements and so forth. Tell us more. How did this come about, and why did it matter to you?
Just Cass Sunstein accosted me the day I arrived at the University of Chicago, and I was dragged brute force into the field. Much of my career has been haphazard.
Somebody recommended you read Kahneman and Tversky, and look
Right,
what happened.
and look what happened, right. And I actually got an email from Cass 6 months before I arrived at the University of Chicago, excitedly saying, "Oh, I'm so glad you're coming." And so we started talking together. And law was an interesting field because the field of law and economics was dominated by true believers in Chicago school economics, like Richard Posner. And the way the field of legal scholarship is a bit odd because most law professors have no graduate training other than having gone to law school, and they did cleverly change the degree they awarded from an LLB to a JD, but it's still
Not everywhere.
yeah, but I mean, obviously that didn't have any effect on the curriculum. And the people that entered law and economics were essentially bullies because they could do a little bit of math and the rest of the law faculty couldn't do any. And, so if one law professor complained that this model was completely unrealistic, the law and economics scholar could just say, well, you just don't really understand. And that was the end of it. So, we had a lot of fun. I will say, just as an aside, since I brought up the name Richard Posner, he may be the only person I know who's really changed his mind about things.
Including about behavioral research.
Yes, and about all kinds of things. He's had a remarkable transformation. I think part of it is he read Keynes. And he had learned that, because he was at the University of Chicago, that Keynes it's on the forbidden reading list at the University of Chicago. And, I take a poll of my students, have you read any Keynes? And none of them have. Yeah. And I think Posner was in that category, and then he read it, and of course had to write a book about it, because both he and Cass can't think without writing.
And Posner's a good writer, it has to be said, as was Keynes. And
Yeah.
Keynes is a lot more enticing than the Wikipedia article about Keynes.
Well, that's right. And, as you know, a point I make in this book is economics was behavioral
Right.
up until Keynes. I mean, he was sort of the
The
last,
whole classical tradition.
starting with Adam Smith, through Keynes,
Yeah.
certainly through Irving Fisher, and right up to Paul Samuelson.
Yep.
And then the process of writing down equations transformed the field in an unintended way. So it's not that Samuelson set out to take the psychology out. He set out, as you know, his PhD thesis has the modest title, Foundations of Economic Analysis. And it was. So that was his thesis, was basically just redo all of economics, but properly. And there's an old story that at his thesis defense, after the committee went through the process of asking him to leave for a moment while and then they talked, did we pass?
Yeah.
So Samuelson didn't set out to be anti-behavioral. And there's nothing, it took a while. There's no reason why behavioral economics can't be formal. But the easiest models to write down are models of rational choice.
Yeah. Well, and you've made clear that you see value in some of the more formal work for certain things. It's the arrogant extension of it to the things it can't handle.
Well, I think the fundamental problem is that economics uses one theory for two tools. And it's a theory of optimization. And it's good to know how to optimize.
It's a good normative theory, a bad descriptive theory.
Exactly. But if you ask what is the theory of the firm, it is that firms maximize value. And then, there are a bunch of equations
Right.
that show you how to do that. Now, anyone who has ever worked in a firm knows that, or any organization, that optimization is, well, maybe your organization.
Absolutely. The LSE is optimal. People have been telling me that since I got here. It's already optimal. Don't change anything.
Right. So you've just mucked things up.
Absolutely.
But, no organization is anywhere close to optimizing.
Right.
But it is useful to know that you would maximize profits by setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. That's a good thing to know. The efficient market hypothesis was essential, as was modern portfolio theory, in teaching us how financial markets should operate. And if I didn't have the efficient market hypothesis or the life cycle hypothesis, which is economic model of saving behavior, if I didn't have those things, I wouldn't have had a theory to criticize.
Which was helpful. A foil can be useful.
Absolutely. I mean, Kahneman Tversky's prospect theory wouldn't have been possible without expected utility theory, which came first. And so there we have the contrast most starkly, since expected utility theory, von Neumann and Morgenstern proved that if you want to make smart decisions under uncertainty, you must follow this. And it wasn't obvious that being linear in probabilities was a required act of rationality.
Turns out.
But, von Neumann showed that it was.
Your friend and colleague Bob Schiller starts out doing rational expectations work, but eventually problems with that lead him
Yeah,
an alternative route to behavior.
that's right. I mean, Bob's famous paper called Do dividends fluctuate too much or something like that? Started out with a simple statistical principle, which is that a forecast can't be more variable than the thing you're forecasting. So, and the stock market
Right.
violates that.
Was, yeah, exactly. So is it the case that throughout this period, including the period of the sort of dominance, the post-World War II ascendancy of a more formal approach in the post-1970s, new micro and all of this, there were always people misbehaving. So, I mean, were Herbert Simon and Tom Schelling misbehaving economists avant la lettre in this sense?
Yeah, well, there were clearly, well, Simon was explicitly trying to do behavioral economics, but he didn't have Kahneman and Tversky. And so he had the terms bounded rationality, which is obviously correct, and he coined the term satisficing,
Right.
which means kind of doing
Most
the best
people
you
settle
can.
for good enough rather than achieving, trying to achieve
Exactly,
perfect.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, when I started working on this, I read Simon, and I didn't find it helpful. And the reason was, I mean, those things were obviously true, but he couldn't tell me how a satisficer differed from an optimizer. And so the big leap, the light bulb that went off for me reading Amos and Danny's work, the early judgment work, was the idea of systematic bias.
Right.
And it was that idea that made behavioral economics possible.
Which we should say is the idea that error is not random.
Right.
All right, so you can always have an error term in your equation or something, but if the error is itself predictable and has a basis, then, yeah.
Then we're in business. So, and Schelling, Schelling was certainly a behavioral economist and was an early supporter of the field. And in fact, I was supposed to, there's now a Tom Schelling lecture that I was supposed to deliver a couple months ago, and then Tom fell or something, and we had to postpone it till the fall. But the title of the lecture I had given them was Behavioral Economics, How It All Came from Schelling.
Okay.
And certainly, I mean, one of Schelling's ideas, sort of the idea that the Nobel Prize Committee picked out, was the idea of focal points. And that's a very psychological idea.
And a very sociological idea. So Schelling collaborated with Irving Goffman for a while in the 50s. And among other things, out of this came an introduction of the idea of framing. 20 years before framing became the concept that became in behavioral economics. And so Goffman does this frame analysis, and Goffman and Schelling do work trying to figure out essentially this concept. It doesn't take off initially and produce that. So one of the interesting things is when the ideas take off. The sociologist Robert Merton used to talk about there's pre-discovery, that for any great discovery, some 10 people had discovered it before and it didn't take off.
Yeah, no, Schelling had a brilliant framing example where he talked about, let's suppose that we make charitable deductions, charitable contributions tax deductible. Well, that means we're subsidizing the contributions of rich people and not of poor people. Now, if you frame it, if you, let's have a public opinion poll. Should we subsidize the donations of rich people by 40% and not at all for poor people? No one would say yes to that. Should we eliminate the charitable deduction? Oh, well, we can't do that.
Ask any university president.
Right. In fact, I've written some New York Times columns on this that I've gotten stern looks from
Well, I'm getting out of that business, so this is, we just got our biggest gift ever and just announced it, and so I'm quitting while I'm ahead on the philanthropy front. But let me stick to that. So there are, I'm so puzzled over takeoff for a moment and the individual idea. So there are other examples. Reference dependence is another sort of major idea in behavioral work where there's the idea of reference groups, and already from Samuel Stouffer, Robert Merton, there are a series of works. The field of behavioral economics as a whole takes off, which is part of why individual ideas within it get more attention, because they're not isolated ideas anymore. I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about that. And there's a story, it can't quite be called a heroic individual illusion because you're very self-deprecating about it in the book, but the story of this happened, that happened. There's also a story, though, of, say, the Russell Sage Foundation, which takes an interest in this from the 80s, somewhere in the 80s forward, and is promoting and has a kind of summer camp and gives fellowships to various people. Does this sort of institutional support play a significant role alongside the intellectual creativity?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I would describe the takeoff path of behavioral economics as resembling that of an albatross. I don't know whether you've ever seen an albatross take off, but it has to run for about 200 yards and then find a cliff to jump off and hope for the best. So that was much like the way our field started. But yeah, we were lucky. There was a guy called Eric Warner who became president of the Russell Sage Foundation.
Highly improbably, having been an editor at Harvard University Press.
Well, trained as a psychologist, and yeah, worked at Harvard University Press. And he got the idea that combining psychology and economics might be a good idea, and gave me a grant to go spend a year with Kahneman, 84, 85, and then gave us some money and said, not a lot of money, by grant-making standards, a pittance. And he said, just do whatever you want with it. And we could have thrown a party, pretty good party for that amount of money. But and I think it was Danny Kahneman's idea to start these summer camps. So this was a 2-week session for graduate students to learn about behavioral economics. The first one, Kahneman and Colin Kammerer and I taught. It's still going on. There's one starting in a couple weeks. David Leibson and Matthew Rabin have been doing it for the last decade or so. And one of the things I'm happiest about is, as I say, David Leibson has been the co-organizer for a long time. He was a camper at the first one.
Ah, okay. Nice.
And Matthew Rabin was, we called him a counselor in training because he had just taken a job at Berkeley and was, so yeah, we've handed it off.
Okay.
I described my main contribution to the field as corrupting youth. And there are many youth in the room I've corrupted, so.
We'll keep doing it. This is good. So this may be part of the answer to the question I wanted to ask. So you recount more than a little resistance from the economics discipline on this 40-year path. And I'm curious whether you think that is just aversion to new ideas and other forms of cognitive bias, or you think that there is something with a stronger incentive behind that resistance?
Well, you know, we know one of the biases that's hardest to overcome is what we economists call the sunk cost fallacy. And
Would you give a chapter to here?
you know, I tell the story, at least I think I tell the story. that I was at a conference once, and there was an economist there, and he, after my talk, I think this was at some NBER conference, and he said, well, you know, what I specialize in is optimization theory. If you're right, what am I supposed to do?
We've just moved all of our operations researchers to the math department.
Yeah, well, right. He was a macroeconomist, so you know, look, we all get invested in our edifices, and so I think some of it was that, but I think a bigger reason, especially at places like the University of Chicago, was, well, I would say a misplaced fear, although maybe others would disagree, that this was basically a communist plot. And the logic goes, you know, neoclassical economics is laissez-faire.
Sure. It won the Cold War, and then people like you came along wanting to surrender.
Exactly. So the idea was, if you conceded that individuals sometimes make mistakes, then it will necessarily follow that you want to eliminate markets and replace it with a planned economy. Now, this is, of course, a ridiculous non sequitur. But this was particularly, so somebody who certainly thought this way was Merton Miller, who was a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago. And I took this out of the book because one is not supposed to write bad things about the dead, but I think you can say them. Oh, wait, we're, anyway. Merton Miller, we were colleagues, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 years before he died. And he literally would not look at me. We would walk in the hall and he would avert his glance. And now, what was he so
was
mad?
Obviously a sort of rational Homo economicus thing to do.
You mean I'm that bad looking? You know, but so he was worried. So he was a financial economist, and he was worried that if we were right, then people would want to regulate financial markets.
Shocking.
Yeah. Horrible idea.
Yeah, clearly that's out of bounds. Yeah.
So, you know, I think that there's a big space between the Wild Wild West and a planned economy, and you know, we nudgers are trying to nudge very, very gently. We don't want to eliminate security markets, but we do think maybe more disclosure would be good.
Transparency of information might be good. So, I mean, another line of behavioral economics actually focused on the issues of asymmetries of information and imperfect information and the way that affected markets. So another strand, I mean, empirically.
Well, yeah, well, although, you know,
George Akerlof used to be here.
You know, Lemon's paper is not a behavioral economics paper.
It's true.
And that whole literature started out just as straight economics.
Yeah.
And now it's true that George moved and became a behavioral economist and is now personal advisor to the chair of the Federal Reserve, which is a good
Yes,
thing.
very personal,
Yes.
but yeah. These are
You don't get the
distinguished
joke.
ex-LSE people, so this is a discussion.
George is married to Janet Yellen, so.
Yeah. So let me ask one last question about a former colleague, although it's conceivable he had retired by the time he got to Chicago, but he's still around, Ron Coase. And we spoke of theory of the firm earlier, and you commented on the very formal propositions theory of the firm and the way they offer a normative account that doesn't do descriptive. In many ways, Ron Coase began his career by going out to actual businesses and seeing what they did, and trying to figure out things that led to transaction cost theory and other kinds of principles that were not behavioral economics, but they were grounded in trying to see the actual behavior of actual managers. And so is this another strand that is, avant la lettre, misbehaving economists all along, actually looking at the real world, not doing equations?
Well, Adam Smith famously visited a pin factory.
Yeah.
And that's a tradition that went out of fashion. There was a bit of a fight in the AER, American Economic Review, in the late 40s, led by a guy called Richard Lester, who was a labor economist. And he went around and asked firms what they were doing. And he came back and reported nobody said they were setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. And so this newfangled marginalist revolution is wrong. And that more or less led to Milton Friedman's famous billiard player analogy that firms behave as if they're rational and
Also gets treatment in the book, the as if.
yeah, that gets a whole chapter.
One of the interesting things to me, I violated my rules, and only one more question, is I'm not sure the history of economics figures very much in the education of economists anymore. So you remarked a few moments ago on Posner reading Keynes rather than a potted summary of what an idiot Keynes was. But my impression is that even a variety of people who say, oh, I'm in favor of this Keynesian remedy, will not have read Keynes, and that the discipline has rather thoroughly embraced the Whiteheadian dogma about a field that hesitates to forget its founders is in trouble.
I'm astonished at graduate school in economics. People rarely read papers more than 20 years old.
Yeah.
So,
which is a willful
the
self-impoverishment.
20th century economics is about to be obsolete.
Exactly. Let alone the early classical
And
economists.
a lot of my younger colleagues who read the book came to me and said that they were astonished to read that there had been all this opposition, because by the time they had gone to graduate school, they were reading papers by Matthew Rabin and David Leibson, and that was part of their graduate curriculum, and But so I mean, I'm as guilty as anyone, but in preparing to write this book, I did go back a little bit and look.
And you've been around a little while, so you know some of this history.
Old, yeah. Old.
All right. Let's open this up to some people who have better and more interesting questions. When you get called on, please wait for the microphone. I'm going to call on the man right in the front row. Raise his hand first. Wait for the microphone, and please tell us who you are when you ask your question.
It's the advantage of being in the front row. My name's Gervais Polden. I work at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. My question is that behavioural economics has been really successful in public policy in a lot of kind of, don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but often kind of micro changes, things where you can easily quantify it and justify it to a treasury paymaster, whether it's changing wording on letters or changing defaults on pension policies or all kinds of things like that. Do you think there's more of an application where you're trying to change perhaps people's behaviour in a more wholesale fashion? And I'm thinking actually particularly my own field in things like environmental challenges, where the challenges are pretty huge in terms of people's mindsets about how they have to think about waste and think about energy policy, and you might really be trying to change quite comprehensively about how they approach these things rather than small individual changes. Do you think there's...
So, in a word, yes. So let me say two things about that. One is, I mean, here's a big picture behavioral view on climate change, which is that the Paris Accord, according to standard economic theory, is completely useless because it's unenforceable. It's just a statement of intentions. And I think that would, now, it may turn out to be useless, but I think that would be a wrong reading because there's been lots of research on cooperation. And a quick summary of that research is people are what we might call conditional cooperators. That I'll cooperate with you if I think you're going to cooperate with me. So I think the step of getting everybody at that conference to agree, at least in principle, to some goal history will decide, but I think it might have been a turning point. The other thing I'll say is at the end of the book, I sort of venture on what I hope comes next, and the thing I'm hoping for is behavioral macro. You know, we had this financial crisis, and the reacting to it, I see Ben Bernanke's picture up here. You know, Ben will freely say that they were making it up as they went along. And so would Mervyn, who has his own book out now. And central bankers now are all interested in what they call forward guidance, which is just a phrase for announcing your intentions. Now, again, a sort of old school economic view of forward guidance is that it's useless. It's cheap talk. But I think the consensus is that it's not useless, but also that nobody has a clue how to do it. And that's inherently a behavioral problem. So what kind of speech should Janet Yellen or Mark Carney be giving about their intentions for the next year is a fantastic behavioral problem that I hope someone studies.
Okay. Notice how I used a kind of nudge to take the microphone away and prevent the follow-up questions. I'm going to prevent it for everyone else, too. The man in the white T-shirt in the back.
You mentioned in your discussion about financial regulation that in terms of securities markets, you wouldn't abolish them, but you would have some disclosure. But isn't disclosure part of the rational action theory rather than behavioral economics?
Well, it depends on how we do the disclosure. And so if you take the efficient market hypothesis to an extreme, it says that the market knows everything instantly. Now, it's a little murky as to how that happened. And if we look at the mortgage-backed securities that helped create the financial crisis, and obviously the definitive treatment of that is the recent movie, The Big Short. You don't really need to do anything but watch that, but particularly one scene. But something that I was lobbying for before I became an actor was that we should be able to know all the attributes of every mortgage in that security. And that was almost impossible information to get. Now, I've worked both here with Owen and my friends at Behavioral Insight Team and in the US at something we call smart disclosure, which is disclosing things in machine-readable files. And I'd like to get rid of rating agencies by making them unnecessary. And because anyone with a PC would be able to be a rating agency. And I think we're a long way from that. So, yeah, maybe that's just standard economics, but as you know, as I say, my hope is that in 30 years, behavioral economics will cease to exist because all of economics will be as behavioral as it needs to be.
Gentlemen in the front row over on this side in the balcony.
Hi. Hi, I'm Vanda. I'm a student here at LSE. I'm just curious if you can give us some examples of Chicago Booth MBA students misbehaving.
Well, I'll tell you an amusing story that will also include faculty misbehaving. So, I don't know how you guys allocate courses to students, but it won't shock anyone to know that the University of Chicago uses a quasi-market system. I say quasi because no money changes hands. But students are given points each quarter, and then they bid for classes. And so the class I teach has always gone for a lot of these points. And the first day of class, I used that fact as an opportunity to talk about the winner's curse. I think I saw Eric here somewhere. So yeah, there you are. I tell them they should, take some other class that's cheaper, and I recommend some. And I once got a call from a reporter who had done some research on which classes were most expensive and called me and asked me about it. And I told them that I use this as a teachable moment, but that I was pretty sure there was a guy in the finance department who used this as a good time to talk about the efficient market hypothesis. And so the reporter was good enough to figure out who I was talking about and called that guy, and he said, yes, in fact, he thinks it is a good illustration of the efficient market hypothesis and shows just how valuable his class is. So yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right, up in the top over on this side. Yeah.
Bob Ward at the Grantham Research Institute here at LSE. How successful do you think behavioural economists have been at persuading decision makers or policymakers in government to use your insights and your methods? And what, if they haven't been particularly successful, what more could they do? Because it seems to be a perfect practical application of your work.
Well, the one type of application of the sort that the Behavioural Insight team here in the UK does, started here. When it started, there were 6 people. How many do you have now, Owen? 100? Yeah. So, and that's because there's demand for their services. There are now, well, what was your count of how many such units there are now?
Probably about 45.
Yeah, so, I think that's just counting countries. There are probably 20 just within the British government. Yeah, so that is spreading like a weed. But if we talk about macroeconomic policy, not so much. I mean, that's maybe both supply and demand. We don't have so much to say about it. But I think certainly the Obama administration has embraced these ideas sort of from top to bottom, and partly it's because he knows it helped him get elected. So there are very simple principles of behavioral science one can use to get people to vote. An idea that was used in 2008 that's now been published, so it's not a big secret, is the tradition was on election day to call people and say, are you planning to support our candidate? And if yes, thank you very much. We appreciate your support. The better way to do it is to say, that's great. What time are you going to go? How are you going to get there? Or even, do you need a ride? So, so the first part is just getting people to make a plan, almost like to put it into their mental calendar. Yeah, I'm going to vote, and I'm going to do it before I go to work. Well, those calls were about 3 or 4% more effective. And they were used in Ohio, where the margin of victory was about 1%. So, nothing like getting somebody elected to get them to listen.
So the woman in glasses near the back, white top.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tracy. I work for a charity called the Health Foundation. I just wonder, we've talked a bit about how behavioural economics, behavioural insight affects or can be used to think about how people make individual decisions, and your book, Nudge, talks about that a lot. I wonder if there's a role for behavioural insights around collaboration, around relationship buildings, helping people to understand how other people think and build coalitions to achieve perhaps public policy in different ways. Perhaps it links to the macro economics that you're talking about.
Well, look, I mean, I'll give a more general answer, which is yes to anything. So, look, there are, as you undoubtedly know, we have a crime problem in Chicago. And some of my colleagues have started a crime lab and are trying to work on these. And I'll tell you very quickly about one intervention they've done with gang members. And it's the following. They'll take 2 gang members and they'll give one of them a ball. And they'll say to the other one that your job is to get that ball from that guy. And then mayhem ensues. And then they stop before anybody gets too hurt. And they do a debrief, and they ask the guy without the ball, did you ever think of asking for the ball? And no. And then they ask the other guy, well, if he had asked you for the ball, what would you have done? Well, I would have given him the damn ball. What with that ball? So the skill they're trying to teach basically is take a deep breath. And most of the violent crime in Chicago happens when people are aroused and angry, and it happens in a few seconds. And if you could just slow them down, if we use Danny Kahneman's System 1, System 2 language, people shoot a gun with System 1. And if we could, I mean, that's why things like a gun lock, even if the guy has a key, can be helpful. So I think behavioral science can be used to help virtually any problem. Will it have solutions that will all of a sudden stop shootings in Chicago? No. But should we be trying? Yes.
I think we should be celebrating a very rare academic behavior, which you may or may not have seen on this stage before, which is that Richard just suggested that somebody else's book was useful. So go get Danny Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. That's not a common academic behavior.
There's no one left that hasn't bought it. So, I mean, I think just go borrow it from somebody because they're not reading it right now.
Exactly.
And buy this. So,
Fair enough.
it was so painful for me, the process of Danny writing that book, that you owe me to buy mine.
You've been impressed. Well, let's ask each of these women, since you can't tell which I'm pointing at.
Hi, my name is Lois. I'm a PhD student in behavioral economics. So my question is, do you think misbehaving or behavioral bias is an innate nature of human beings arising from our, for example, Darwin's natural selection, or do you think it's something that can be nurtured to be eliminated in the long term? For example, will we become more rational over the long term as a mankind? In the case that if the whole world is full of economists?
Yes.
And will that be a good thing?
I mean, no, I'm yes to both. So, look, there's a branch of psychology called evolutionary psychology that I'm actually not a big fan of because lacking a time machine, I don't know how to test these ideas. So, but there are some things that are intuitively obvious, which is as a species, we survived by eating everything we could when we could. So that worked very well when you're at subsistence, and we now have 30% obesity. So we haven't had an abundant supply of cheap food for very long. So evolutionary forces are slow, we know that. Will we get smarter? Sure, but slowly. And, basic human instincts don't change. We still eat, we still have sex, and if we didn't, the species would end.
Hi, my name is Alex Doyle. I'm also at the Department of Energy and Climate Change and an LSE student. I was reading some of your papers the other day from the 80s, so over 20 years old.
Good job.
I know. And there were a lot about mental accounting, which obviously you've covered in the book. But for me, it felt like it was an undercovered behavioural phenomenon, perhaps because it doesn't have a neat graph like prospect theory. And I wondered if you sort of now had any reflections on its sort of updated.
On what? I missed one word.
On mental accounting.
Well, that's my favorite subject. I think everything is mental accounting. And I do think it's been understudied. There are theories of reference dependence, which is part of mental accounting. Where in prospect theory, where do you put the reference point? But just a part of it. And there are lots of other dimensions of mental accounting. I'd like to see theorists working on that problem. And I think it's a domain that is underworked. So go for it.
Okay. Yes, very back next to the camera.
Yeah, and then we've
And
got
then
one
we've got
here
Eric
too.
over here. Okay.
Hi, my name is Mads. I do a master's here at LSE, Organizational and Social Psychology. Now, Gary Klein presents the naturalistic decision-making, which is a very positivist view of decision-making in complex environments. I was wondering what you thought about that within the kind of slightly less positivistic view of behavioral economics of decision-making, and how do you think they fit or do not fit together?
Yeah, I think, so the question is about Gary Klein's work. He and Danny Kahneman spent a lot of time trying to collaborate on some joint vision of two different views of decision-making, and ended up having a friendly failure. And I think his research it's kind of analogous to anthropology, that it's hard to import. So there are stories about, he's done a lot of work studying how firefighters make decisions, and the kind of instinctive way they know when to get the hell out of there. But I haven't seen any way of making that empirically rigorous. And that's the step somebody would have to take for us to be able to import it into economics. So it's very much the same as somebody goes and spends 6 months living with a tribe. They're going to learn stuff, but then how are we going to import that into economics? There will be several steps in between.
Okay, over in this corner, then we'll go to the woman in the back.
Yeah, Bernard Casey from LSE. Just a quick point. Actually, wasn't it anthropologists who did quite a lot of work on theories of cooperation, which were relevant to economists? What I wanted to actually ask about was, we have this thing called Homo economicus, and then we have this thing called Homo sapiens, which is set against him. I was talking to a social psychologist recently, and we were talking about something called common sense. So there's also something called common sense economics, which might be rather pervasive. I remember years ago somebody who was the chief economist at the OECD wrote a book where he talked about businessman's economics, which seemed to be another case of common sense economics. Can you say how common sense economics relates to the sort of economics that Homo sapiens is supposed to operate?
Well, one of my Reuter lines is that getting a PhD in economics teaches you a lot of mathematical tools and then removes common sense. And much of behavioral economics is just admitting what anybody who's never studied economics already knows. So I think that's all I'm going to say about that.
Hey, I'm Marianne. I'm an MSc student here at LSE. It's sort of related to the questions that have been asked before, and to this Freakonomics episode that you were on, in terms of like moving towards being Homo economicus, and that will get smarter more slowly. Do you think that's good? You talked about like the being
that
nicer
was a joke.
and self-control, yeah?
So yeah, there is a Freakonomics episode where I try to teach somebody how to become Homo economicus. And yeah, it was really meant as entertainment. And some of the aspects of Homo economicus we don't really want to teach. So we'd like people to be more cooperative. And I think there's been several papers back and forth about whether training in economics makes people less cooperative, or is it just that only jerks study economics? And so, I mean, you know, are economists born or made is the, and I'd say this is an unsettled question. But there is data to suggest that economists are less likely to cooperate in a prisoner's dilemma game. Now, the economists will say, well, that's because they know the dominant strategy. But, you know, Amartya Sen described such people as rational fools. So we know in a cooperative game, we all do better if we cooperate, even if it's in our selfish, rational self-interest not to cooperate. So, I mean, this does go back to like things like climate change, and it influences how one would try to affect changes. And look, there are big issues that I think social scientists, and including behavioral economics, should be studying. One huge one is corruption. And there are some societies where corruption is a way of life, that you can't really get anything done without bribing people. How does that happen? And can we change it? I don't know the answer to either of those things, but I'd like to know. And somebody young like you should study it.
And Amartya Sen, who is older than either of us, will be here on Friday, and so you can follow up the rational fools question there. Gentleman in the blue jacket over here. And then we'll come.
Hi, I was wondering, can behavioural economics help me in deciding how I should vote in the EU referendum? Or will it just explain it after the event?
Well, it's funny you should ask that, because I was sort of invited to appear on Newsnight tonight, which was going to interfere with my drinking at a dinner party that some of us are going to afterwards. And then I got a call this afternoon talking about what to talk about, and of course they wanted to talk about Brexit. And I said, you know, I'm a behavioral economist. And the question they wanted to know was something about the relation between immigration and jobs. And, you know, I said there must be 100 other economists in London that are better qualified to answer that question than me. But I do think there are interesting behavioral aspects of it. Let's go back to the framing. The very words they chose probably mattered. What is it, leave or remain? Those. Now, there are lots of synonyms for both of those words. I don't know whether they collected any data. If anyone had asked me, I would have suggested collecting some data. But I think that had I gone on that show, I probably would have talked about, I think, the most apt analogy, which is divorce. We've all known lots of people that have gone through divorces, including some of us. And I've had a conversation with many people that starts with, I'm getting a divorce, and, you know, I'm very sorry to hear that. But it's all fine it's going to be very amicable. And I say, have you started to talk about money yet? And no, but it's all going to be amicable. And I'd say the percentage of those that are amicable is very small. So what I would say to people who are thinking about leaving is I wouldn't vote to leave until I had a separation agreement. And as far as I know, there is none.
Indeed.
It would have been good to have a prenup. You see what Newsnight is missing?
And we are all. So once again, you're not going to be able to distinguish who I'm pointing at, so get both of these gentlemen who are here.
Hello, myself Prem from LSE. The question is, when you came up with the title Nudge for your book, did you ever try to apply the letter U, that is understanding mapping of the nudge for giving the title to the book?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. So first of all, I should say that the title of the book was suggested to us by a publisher who turned it down. And, you know, we were smart enough to take the title. And, you know, I think it was a nice word, even if some people mispronounce it.
But did you do any research to find out how many people would mispronounce it? I think that was the question.
No. Finding the title of a book is really hard. We didn't have a title, as that story indicates. We didn't have a title when we were selling the book. It was going to be a book about libertarian paternalism, and you know, you can see publishers were lined up to publish that. The same was true of this book. Let's see, it was published a year ago. The previous summer, I was here. In September, and there was already a first draft, and I was working on the final draft, and there was still no title. And I was desperately going around talking to all my friends at this conference that the Behavioral Insight team organized. And one of my friends, Craig Fox, I told him, I was very close to misbehaving, but he said, did you think about misbehaving? I said, that's it. But again, no research. I knew that was the title.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Raghav. I'm doing my master's here at LSE. So you were in India last year to talk about the Clean India Initiative. And
I talked about what?
The Clean India Initiative with the government, about how to clean the villages and how to go about stopping something like open defecation. And I was trying to read about it online, but I couldn't find the insights that you had discussed in closed rooms there. So if you could give me an insight on what was discussed and what could be done to overcome that.
So there was one word I missed in that, and it was a key word. So I'm not exactly sure
what initiative? Was that the word?
Initiative for the Clean India Initiative in India?
Yeah, okay. Yes. Well, this is the problem of open defecation. And, I mean, I may have used this line last year. There's a friend of mine here who has the best line on that topic, which is to say, the TED Talk on that problem is there's no TED Talk. And I was going to use that line until I found out there was a TED Talk.
Ever the empiricist.
But there shouldn't be. So, I mean, this is a good example of a really hard problem. And you know, we Westerners naturally think that if you just build toilets, people will use them. And that turns out to be false, especially for men. Men are always the problem. And look, the fact that they probably don't smell very good may have something to do with it. You know, think of the bad portable toilets you've used at concerts and things. But that's a problem that no one's cracked, as far as I know. And it will take a combination of design and behavioral science, and no one's come up with it yet.
Okay, alas, we're near the end of the time, so one last question, as promised here, this woman in the second row of the balcony.
Hi, my name is Nicole Vashuba. I do a PhD in political decision making. And you mentioned the Obama government has picked up on your ideas. So I'm wondering, how did you nudge them to use the nudge?
We showed some people in the Obama campaign data. It's as simple as that. You know, the campaign was located in Chicago, so. And actually, in the 12 campaign, the finance chairman is now the ambassador to Britain. In fact, I had a drink with him last night. He has a very nice house. His backyard is big enough that he's going to have a cricket match on the 4th of July. So I recommend becoming the American ambassador to the UK. It looks like a good gig.
Okay, so advice you can act on.
Yeah, there
you
you go.
heard it here. Please join me in thanking Richard Thaler.